Hi, I'm Kyle Cunningham, Associate Professor of Forestry with the University of Arkansas System, Division of Agriculture. Today I'm going to be sharing a video from our Bottomland Hardwood Education Group meeting discussing hardwood management specific to the Western Gulf region in the Southeast. Today's talk will focus on components of natural regeneration, factors for success, with a in-depth discussion on sunlight and its role in promoting oaks in the regeneration pool, previous research results, and kind of how we got to where we are today with the recommendations and the methodologies that we promote for our stands. And we will end with harvest methods to promote fully stocked oak stands in the region. Hope you enjoy the video. Thank you.
Just quickly to put us back into perspective, we're talking about the Western Gulf region here. So we're talking about the area from the LMAV westward through Louisiana, Texas, and southwest Arkansas. It does include southeast Oklahoma, but we really don't have any bottomland hardwood sites in that part of the world. So we're really talking about Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. And as Mike pointed out, we have some shared river systems, and then we have some individual river systems that perform well with many of our bottomland hardwood species, or good sites for those. And so that's the area of the world we're talking about. I did want to hit on a few things that we discussed on Tuesday, and that is, I'm going to talk about different harvest and targeting different product classes in the stand at different points in time today. And there's currently, we haven't had these issues in a long time. Even before, the last time we had these issues, I was a kid, and but they're showing their head again. And the first current issue we're having with hardwood management in the Western Gulf region and across the South, for that matter, is that pulpwood markets for hardwoods are drying up. And in many areas of the Western Gulf region, there is no hardwood pulp market today, and that wasn't the case even just a few years ago. And so that's a real problem for us. There was a Forest to Market put out a paper a week or so ago that showed that demand for hardwood pulp was down 20% over the past year overall, and some of that was due to international trade tariffs and things like that, and just the international demand, and then also obviously from the pandemic, the impacts from the pandemic on demand for office supplies and school supplies and those types of things have really dropped the demand for hardwood pulp. And we literally only have a couple, 2 or 3 pulp mills in the entire Western Gulf region to service a very large area now. And so, that's an area. Is it temporary? I hope so. I hope that the demand will increase, and some of these mills that are shutting down their hardwood machines will see an increased demand and a need for opening those back up. And that's the thing with timber markets, and in particular with hardwood timber markets, is they're very cyclical, particularly in the saw timber realm, but hopefully we see that with the pulp as well, and that this is just an ephemeral issue that we're dealing with. The availability of harvesting crews that can properly harvest large hardwood forests is shrinking. This is a huge issue. There's a higher percentage out there. There's a lower percentage of harvesters overall, and there's certainly a lower percentage that are capable of harvesting some of these high value stems in the bottomland hardwood forest. And there's a higher percentage within those that remain of production oriented harvesters, and they, it's no fault of their own, but they're really not set up and trained to go into these hardwood stands and do thinnings and not create some damage to the site and to the stems there, because it's just not what they normally do. And so that's an issue. And then the sawmill capacity and demand is still good for hardwood logs, and so that's good. Management implications of these concerns: the lack of a pulpwood market has resulted in high grading in many cases. I've heard of this happening in Louisiana in many cases, and because you guys in Louisiana ran out of your hardwood pulp market before the rest of us did, and so we're seeing some instances where they just can't. It's no fault. I mean, they're not going in high grading on purpose necessarily, but there's just no market and no ability to move that material. And so it makes properly implementing natural regeneration harvest very difficult. So what do we do? And we, a couple of the attendees talked about this in our chat discussion the other day. Identify other markets: pallet mills, chip mills, charcoal mills, pellet mills. Look for those smaller markets. They certainly aren't going to facilitate the entire Western Gulf region. There's just too much volume out there for that. But maybe in your particular area, you can take advantage of a niche market or a local market. Expand the mid-story injection to target stems to include pulpwood. So maybe some of these stems that are 6, 7, 8 inches in diameter, when we're trying to regenerate one of these stands, those are stems that are in the way, and if they're not desirable or acceptable species, we don't want to leave those in there. They're just taking up growing space and suppressing our regeneration efforts. And so maybe we inject some of those. I've already had some foresters tell me in some of our upland regions where we historically have had poor hardwood pulp markets that they are actually doing some injection work on some of the stems that could be merchantable in the stand. I don't like that, but it's life. It's if you're going to manage these stands, the pulpwood has to be dealt with. And there are some cost share programs that actually will cover the cost of doing some of this injection work for forest stand improvement. And so maybe you can still get some revenue to cover those losses of not capturing that pulpwood value. Or do we look at, when we talk about from a natural regeneration or from a regeneration standpoint, do we look at simply clear cutting and doing some supplemental planting of desirable species? And then you got to do some cost analysis. Is it more expensive to do the mid-story injection and include pulpwood in it, or is it more costly to go in and plant trees? And obviously, it probably would be a little bit more costly to do supplemental planting, but there is a place for that, and I may get to be able to hit on that a little bit today, but we'll see about that. We may have to be patient and diligent in finding an available and qualified harvester with regard to the harvesters that are out there. I think one of the things that we need to do as foresters, is particularly those of us that have the hardwood management background, is work with the potential harvesters in an area. And if they haven't been harvesting in hardwoods, what I have found, and I'll talk about this in the thinning presentation, what I have found is if you'll work with them and be a little bit patient with them, they can pick it up. The differences between harvesting pine for production versus slowing down a little bit and taking your time in a high quality hardwood stand. But again, saw timber production remains the key to successful hardwood management for timber. That's where I've talked about this over and over. That's where the value is, and you're managing these stands for a long period of time, and you need to get to those higher value products as quickly as possible if you're looking at these forests from a revenue stream standpoint. So those are just some ideas I wanted to mention before I get into these talks. They are issues that I normally in the past several years would not have to address, but currently as we sit, the pulpwood market and the harvester availability, those are two issues that you must face if you're going to do some management operations in these stands. So let's move into being successful with natural regeneration. Let's focus on natural regeneration. So we're using the seed and seedlings present in the stand to regenerate a new stand. And the key factors that we need to be successful in natural regeneration: we need a seed source, we need a seed crop. That is do not understate. I cannot emphasize that enough. The idea of seed crop. If you're going to do natural regeneration and you don't have advanced natural regeneration in place, you better have a seed crop the year that you're beginning your natural regeneration operations, and we'll hit on that some more. Soil fertility, soil moisture, those are more inherent factors that either they're there or they're not. And then the role of sunlight. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about sunlight, and really I'm going to spend a lot of this presentation not as much on the actual operations, but on these factors and the environmental conditions that are associated with being successful you guys are foresters, you're familiar with most of the harvesting methods, and I will talk about those in the context of how do we create these favorable sunlight conditions to promote oak natural reproduction. So real quickly, the components of natural regeneration: you can either have new seedlings, advanced reproduction, or stump sprouts. And the things we're looking for, the two that we're looking for, are advanced reproduction and stump sprouts. Those are the two components that are going to help guarantee that we have a successful regeneration harvest when we're ready to regenerate one of these systems. New seedlings, they're recent germinants, but they typically lack size to be competitive, and they don't have the root system. But we can see large numbers in years with good acorn crops. And so they can create a large pool of seedlings in a short period of time. Advanced regeneration, and some traditional silviculturists would tell me to remove the D there, but I'm so used to saying advanced, I just continue to put it in my slides. But advanced regeneration, we're talking about reproduction that's present prior to the harvest, has established root systems, and they're typically 1 to 4 feet tall. So they have a little bit more size to them. Stump sprouts, in the older stands, we really can't count on these, but they are really high vigor. Nothing's going to outcompete a stump sprout, and the certain species are more have a higher propensity to stump sprout than others. And if you have those, water willow oak and those types of things, you're ahead of the game there. Particularly if you need to go in and do some clear cutting. But stump sprouts are really important to us. We just can't always count on them, particularly as the stands age. There's some research out there that that shows the probability of oak stems to resprout based on diameter, and the larger the diameter, the less the chance is that they will resprout. So we can't necessarily count on that. Okay, there is an evaluation tool, and we would typically go over this in this presentation. We have pre and post harvest. We need to have pre and post harvest evaluation of our oak regeneration pool. So we need to go out and throw in some 100th acre plots along with our overstory plots. Okay, so back to the question we talked about on Tuesday of how many trees per acre do I need to have to consider a stand to be manageable? Well, we could also ask the question, how many stems per acre of reproduction do I need to successfully regenerate a stand? And I come back to the chart, or to the table that we talked about on Tuesday, and if we go back to our number of that idea of that understock level being kind of the baseline of what we would like to see from a manageable trees per acre standpoint, and we look at the average DBH of 14 inches, so small saw timber, we're looking at needing 50 trees per acre. So how do we, walk that back to year 0 and come up with a number for what we need? And, the answer to that is you probably need, somewhere between 300 and 500 stems per acre that you could count on regenerating and being free to grow and getting into the overstory. That's my thought on this. And then, through mortality and thinning and whatnot, by the time you get to your small saw timber, you're down to 50. So that's kind of just my thought process on this, and of course the Oaks computer program puts those into more quantitative numbers. But that's just a kind of to paint you an idea of what we're looking at here. And this is one area I need to make a point. We talk about different species and desirability ratings and injection of the mid-story, and you can there's people that look at these stands for non-timber purposes, or you may have somebody that you're working with that's really opposed to using herbicides in a stand or something like that. And this is the point I want to make when we're talking about managing for oaks. We drive we need oaks. We need oaks in these stands for your timber revenues. And losing species like ash, it even makes that more important. But we're not talking about creating oak monocultures here. You're not going to do that in natural regeneration, number one. That is not going to happen. What we are trying to do is create a window of time through our efforts, through either our injection work or the partial harvesting that we're going to talk about, to get a new cohort of oak regeneration established. Because if we don't take the time and proper steps to do that, over time and we've seen this over the last 100 years or so, we are diminishing the amount of oak in these stands over time with every harvest. And so what we're trying to do here is just keep oak as a significant component in these stands. And there's been a lot of heated discussion over some of the harvest methods associated with different management objectives. And that's where in this meeting I always emphasize we are talking about having timber production and a revenue stream as at least one of our primary objectives for these discussions we're having today. And so we're talking about having oak not just be present in the stand, but a significant component of the stand. And so, maybe it's 50% of the stand or 40% of the stand or some number like that. It's not a monoculture, but we certainly don't want to see oak be 5 or 10% of the stand, because from a harvesting and commercial harvesting standpoint, that's not getting us where we want to be from a timber production standpoint. Okay, so let's talk about the role of sunlight. You think about a little oak seedling down there on the forest floor, and this is a hemispherical photo from some of the sunlight work we did years ago, and you can see that little seedling is trying to get some sunlight through all this canopy up above it. And oak seedlings are, depending on the species, they're intermediate in shade tolerance at best, and some of our red oak species are not intermediate. Sometimes they get listed as intermediate, but they're really not. They need more sunlight. So let's talk about the role of sunlight. As I stated, oak seedlings are moderately shade tolerant to intolerant. Many of the competitors are shade tolerant. Many of the competitors on our species list that we list as unacceptable species are shade tolerant, and that's one of the reasons that we have them in there. Even though they have value, they are a hindrance to trying to obtain oak regeneration. And so we have more reasons than just the marketability of the species with regard to placing them in species acceptability categories. And this is one of those areas we want to focus on having some oaks in here, and we don't. And in order to do that, we have to reduce the amount of shade tolerant species that we have in the stand, at least for some period of time. Early growth, first few years, the oaks are going to focus on root growth, where many of the competitors focus on top growth. And so there's less focus on shoot growth until the seedlings are established. And so when you're doing natural regeneration, if you don't have those large size advanced regeneration or reproduction present, you have to create an environment that's going to allow those to establish. And so I have some slides here to kind of drive this home. This is a conceptual representation of oak regeneration success over a range of moisture and light levels. This was created by Dr. Hodges and Emil Gardner, and Dr. Hodges and Dr. Gardner, I should say. And it just gives you an idea. And we're talking about bottomland hardwood stands. So we're here on the mesic scale. We're from mesic out to xeric on the moisture scale here, and we're from closed to open on the light. And what we find with all of our research is there's this happy medium of partial shade and partial sunlight that needs to be created to establish the oak regeneration. And if you're in a closed canopy stand on a wet site, or an open or a very open canopy on a wet site, your oak regeneration is going to have a hard time developing. And it goes back to that previous slide. This partial shade, partial sunlight environment gives those seedlings a period of time for them to develop root systems and be more competitive with regard to the species and competitors around them. As we move up on the drier sites, the window becomes larger, and oaks can get a competitive advantage if you get out far enough on the moisture scale as you head towards the drier sites. Okay, so that just drives that home. And then just kind of wrap that up, if I have a high sunlight environment, so a clear cut or a large group selection or something like that, I'm going to favor fast growing shade intolerant species and the development of any large advanced oak reproduction. So if I do have that in place, I'm fine. I'm fine. Those ceilings are going to grow and compete and do fine in that environment. Um, the partials, if I move down into partial sun, partial shade, this allows the oak ceilings time to grow, and the ceilings, if we're talking about going from a closed canopy stand to an open canopy stand, it gives those ceilings time to transition from a shade adapted environment to a sunlight adapted environment. I did my PhD research here in Arkansas on that very topic. And just to slow down for a minute, you can walk through mature hardwood stands, and you might see some oak, particularly with the red oaks, you might see some oak regeneration in there that's 6 inches, 8 inches, maybe even a foot tall. But they may only have they may only have 3 or 4 or 5 leaves on them, and the leaves are actually trying to be shade adapted. And oaks don't do that very well to dense shade, but they're trying to take on the characteristics of a shade tolerant species. And they almost I like to word it this way, they almost go into a period of senescence. So they're really not doing very much. They're sitting there. They may actually top kill and resprout. You may go in and see an oak seedling that's a foot tall that could be 10 or 20 years. It could be 10 or 15 years old. It just keeps dying back and resprouting. And of course, they can't do that forever. But you could be looking at that scenario. And so those seedlings, when you first expose them, what I found in my work is when you first expose them to the higher sunlight intensities, it takes them a period of time to adjust and to physiologically adjust to that increased light environment. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish with this partial sun, partial shade light environment, is an environment that allows those seedlings to make that physiological adjustment, to put on some extra root growth, and be ready to compete when we begin removing the overstory. So if we're down and if we keep moving down into the low sunlight environment, where we have 90 or 95% crown closure, we're talking about promoting shade tolerant species and small oak seedlings, as I discussed. And so that's kind of the concept here. And this is so how do we get to these light environments? And this is a slide. This paper is in your notebook under the Regeneration folder. This is one we did on some work on a cherry bark oak stand over on the Tombigbee River in Alabama back several years ago. And what we looked at in here was, well, how do we create these partial shade, partial sun light environments, and how do they tie into the work that some of the hardwood researchers before us did, looking at light environments and physiological activity and growth and development of oak seedlings. And so I should have done this. So BA6, that's basal area 30 residual. BA11, that's basal area 50 residual. And BA16, that's basal area 70 in residual. So that's open. And then this BA50 is kind of the medium level of residual. And then we have the more closed canopy with the residual being BA70. The IO means injection only, so there was no overstory removed there, just the injection work. And then this is our non-harvest control. And so let's first look at crown closure, which is our red line. In these stands, think of global site factor. Well, no, not on crown closure. We have crown closure on the right axis over here. So non-harvest control, before we did anything, we were looking at 95% crown closure, and we're looking at almost 90 to 95% crown closure, very little sunlight. For the global site factor, you can think of this basically as the percent sunlight. So this will be from 10 to 60% of full sunlight reaching the ground. And so we're at 95% crown closure, but over here we have to come back down. And so for the GSF, 95% crown closure relates to less than 10% of full sunlight for the non-harvest control. As we move up to the injection only, in this stand we had such a closed overstory that when we removed the midstory, we only saw about a 5 to 7% increase in light, which was not enough. So in this case, the injection only did not get us where we wanted to be with regard to increased sunlight. So let's look at the different harvest intensities, and all of these did include the injection work. And so this is the partial harvest plus the injection of mid-story. And so our basal area is 70. We had a crown percentage, closure percentage of around 82 or so, and then that related to our percent sunlight of about 25 or 26% of full sunlight. Here, this is kind of the minimum. If you look at some of the work from Emil Gardner and John Hodges and Brian Lockhart, this is kind of if you look at and Brian Lockhart, this is kind of that minimum range that you need to start saying, okay, I'm getting enough sunlight for the oak seedlings to develop. The BA50, you're going to hear me talk about the BA50, and you've probably already heard that. The basal area 50 residual plus the injection work in this case, and in so many cases, gets us to a little over 85% crown closure. Gets us, I said that backwards, gets us to about 70%. Now we're seeing a shift in our crown closure versus our inverse relationship here between crown closure and percent sunlight. And so here we have about 70% crown closure, and we're looking at between 40 and 45% of full sunlight on average. And so that is, and this is kind of that happy medium. This is where the magic happens, so to speak. This is that light environment that we predicted in this study, and we've seen it in subsequent studies since this time. This is that light environment. If you're dealing with a closed canopy, mature hardwood stand that has a mid-story in place, this is that prescription that's going to get you to that light level. And so it's not, and I need to point out, it's not so much that it's the basal area 50 plus the injection work that's doing this. It's the light environment that's created. And so if you have a stand that's different, if you have a stand that's been thinned several times or doesn't have a mid-story in place, maybe you can make adjustments to your treatments. Maybe you don't have to take out the mid-story. Maybe you don't have to do the mid-story work, or maybe you do have to do the mid-story work, but you don't have to do the overstory harvesting because it's already been done. And I've seen that in a lot of cases where the injection work is going to be the primary operation. But if you're dealing with a closed canopy stand with heavy mid-story, this is the treatment that's going to get you there, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. The basal area 30 residual, we were looking at about a little over 65% crown closure, but we were up in getting up over 50% of full sunlight. And one of the concerns we have here is you're almost getting in a scenario where you may have too much sunlight. You're promoting a lot of fast-growing herbaceous and woody species that are going to probably outcompete your oaks in that area. And we've seen that in some of the work since that time. So these are the sunlight environments that we worked on early on in my work, and it had already been taking place before I started all of this. And we tied that into the work that has been done by many of the hardwood researchers. This graph is just to show that when we talk about the average sunlight, it's not that you're maintaining that 50% sunlight all day long. If you think about canopy gaps and doing partial harvest and removing the mid-story, you're going to have fluctuations in sunlight. And this red line here illustrates that very well. The green line here is full sunlight, so it represents a diagonal curve of full sunlight from about 10 in the morning until about 3 in the afternoon. And so this red line shows these canopy gaps where you get up to these periods of full sunlight, but they're ephemeral, and then we go back down into a shaded environment. And so if we, what we've come up with is the idea of having 40 to 50% full sunlight, and that's this dark colored band here. Full sunlight runs just around 2100 micromoles here on the graph, and so from about 600 to 1000 is getting us in that range, and that's why we come back to this treatment of BA50 plus mid-story removal. Throughout the day, we are hitting this average light intensity right here. In the undisturbed stand, we're nowhere near that level, obviously, And in this study, this was from some of my PhD work. This was in the uplands, but the theory is still the same. The BA50 residual plus an intact midstory. So in this case, we had a heavy midstory in this stand, and just doing the overstory work in place, and really didn't get us where we wanted to be either, because we still had that heavy midstory in place in many places. And so this just shows you, if you have that intact midstory in place, you're still not getting to where you want to be just by doing the partial overstory removal. Okay, so kind of a summary of this study. Non-harvest control, we were looking at about 4%. BA50 alone, we were looking at about 30% of full sunlight on average across the treatment. And so, overall on this treatment, we were in that minimum range, and we did see some oak regen come into this treatment. It's just we really would prefer to see a little bit more sunlight, and so that's where we see that with the BA50 plus the midstory removal at the 45% level. And we see this in the uplands and the bottomlands. If you have a mature closed canopy stand, this treatment right here is going to get you in that range in most cases. So this is just to dig a little deeper and to drive this point home a little bit further. So this is also from some of my doctoral work here. If you look at photosynthesis versus sunlight intensity in recently released hardwood reproduction, I talked about when these seedlings are first released, they're really not ready to compete, and they're not physiologically, they're not ready to utilize all of the full sun, the sunlight that's reaching the leaves. This is actually electron transport, but it's a proxy measure of photosynthesis here. Correlated very well in the study with photosynthesis rate. If we look here, our oak species, particularly our red oak, this is what I talked about. Those little seedlings are not ready. They haven't made that physiological adjustment. If we look out here at sunlight intensity, as we get out here in the more open, higher sunlight environments, they are not really going to have as high a photosynthesis rate as some of their competitors. And here we have a shade tolerant in winged elm, and then a shade intolerant in black cherry, that both are going to, from a photosynthesis standpoint, are out competing the oaks at a very early stage here. So we want to back that sunlight intensity down to keep these seedlings photosynthesis rates and physiological activity as close as possible until the oaks get to where they can increase these rates and increase their physiological activity. And that's really getting into it a little more in depth, but I just wanted to this points out, and from a physiological standpoint, how that's occurring. So our summary of sunlight canopy penetration, I wanted to spend a lot of time on this to describe that what we're trying to do is create sunlight environments, and there may be different ways that you can manage a stand or harvest a stand to create these environments depending on the initial stand conditions that you're working with. And so for undisturbed stand conditions, you're looking at less than 10% sunlight in these mature hardwood forest closed canopy stands. The injection of the midstory, we've seen from 5 to 15% increases in sunlight. So in some cases that may get you there, but in these, if you're starting out with that dense overstory, it's really not going to get you to where you want to be. The basal area 30 residual is probably removing too much material. We're really releasing a lot of really strong competitors in those environments. The BA50 alone is getting us kind of the minimum that the seedlings need to develop and grow. And so over a period of years, you're going to, obviously that level of light is going to decrease, and so it may get you where you want to be, but it's going to be risky. And when we add the midstory injection to that, we see those sunlight environments hit that target that we're looking for. The BA70 plus midstory removal, again, is you may start out with an adequate sunlight environment, but you better have some follow-up disturbances coming behind that, because you're not going to stay in that range very long in those situations. Okay, so how do we create these? And I wanted to talk about management systems and regeneration methods. Management systems, we're talking about even age systems or two age systems or uneven age systems. That's the way I like to think of this. And an even age system is what we focus on primarily in our bottomland efforts across the South historically, because of the shade intolerance of our desirable species. And so we're looking at one age class basically in our crop species. We also could see two-age stand. There are many hardwood stands across the South that are two-aged, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can manage two-aged stands and still have an oak component present in these stands. Uneven age management, where we have 3 or more age classes, becomes very difficult when you start trying to do this with species like oak. And then when you put the constraints of the markets that we're dealing with and the harvesting constraints that we have right now, they really become even more difficult. And so for most of our landowners, these are really not feasible, particularly when you're dealing with landowners that may only cut once every family generation or something like that. They're just not managing the stands intensely enough to do that type of management. And so typically we're trying to do either even age management or two-age management, with the idea that we're going to use the even age regeneration methods at some point in time. So what are even age methods? We have clear cut, we have shelter wood, and really what we do in these bottomland stands that I'm going to talk about today are modified shelter woods, and that really is just introducing the timber stand improvement work or the natural regeneration site preparation work with the herbicide injection. Both methods, both clear cutting and shelter wood, can be very successful if you have oak regeneration in place, or if you have a scenario where you can count on stump sprouts with your species compositions. Clear cutting can be a viable option. And the uneven age methods, though, again, it's going to be very difficult. Single tree selection has done more harm to our southern hardwood forest, than any other harvesting method. Even when we get into thinning these stands, that's probably the #1 method that has been used in hardwood stands across the South and here in the Western Gulf region over the years, is single tree selection. Whether you're thinning the stand or doing regeneration. And oftentimes it just simply results in high grading, and I'll talk about that in the thinning presentation. But that's not what we want to be using in these stands. It's not going to. If you do single tree selection, you will wind up transitioning those stands to shade tolerant species over time. Group selection, that's one that has a little bit more debate around it. I think you can do group selection and be successful, but again, you have to have many of these check boxes checked that we talked about with regard to having some oak regeneration in place and ready to go. If you don't have the oak regeneration in place, and your groups aren't the groups aren't large enough, you're still going to run into some problems with regeneration there. But group selection, that's one up for debate as far as and it's really dependent on the scenario you're dealing with regard to could it be successful or not. Okay, so the modified shelter wood, let's spend a little bit of time talking about that. We're talking about controlling the mid-story and understory through herbicide injection. Prescribed fire, we use that a lot in our upland work that we do in the Ozark regions and the upland regions of the state. If you're up on a terrace, some of these high terraces that can dry out, maybe fire is an option there. One thing I will say with fire is it in hardwood stands, it is a cool season tool only if you have quality timber on site, or if you have species that don't handle fire very well, such as cherry bark oak. I have seen some disasters in cherry bark oak stands where they tried to incorporate a fire into those stands for non-timber objectives. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage done to those stands by incorporating fire. And so we really have to be careful of trying to incorporate fire into a stand where we want to have some quality saw timber. We remove the overstory in a series of harvests. That's usually 2, a preparatory cut, and then a final cut once we get our oak regeneration in place. And so what does that look like? We have our initial stand here with very little sunlight reaching the ground. We do our injection work. We increase the sunlight reaching the ground. And then we do that initial partial harvest where we're removing a lot of the pulpwood and leaving a lot of the seed producing trees. So we're leaving a lot of the larger crowned stems on site to provide seed and to provide the adequate sunlight environment that we're looking for. Those intermediate crowns are not going to provide the seed, and they're also not going to give you the sunlight environment that's going to promote the oak reproduction, growth, and development. So that's what we're looking at, and then this is kind of a flow chart. I'll let you look at this so we can get moving here. One thing I will say is right here where I have this red line of the fall of year one, after we've done our herbicide injection, we want to come in and go ahead and do the initial partial harvest. Well, without a pulpwood market, what do we do right here? And this is one of those hurdles that we have to look at. How can we address removing that material? And I talked about that earlier, so I won't hit on that too much today on this slide. But that's going to be the next year or two while we deal with this lack of demand for hardwood pulp over the next few years. This is going to be a hurdle. But if we get that done, then we're simply waiting for desirable reproduction to get in place. And if it is, we remove all or most of the overstory trees on site. Okay, talk a little bit about the injection work here. Most of you are familiar with injection now. We're talking about hack and squirt, where you basically just take a hatchet out there and your herbicide and inject each of the stems. Just a little bit of a few examples here. We have non-injected here. This is on one of our upland sites, and then you can see post-injection how much just the injection work in this upland site increased sunlight to the ground. You can already see this stand greening up in here, and a lot of these are actually oak seedlings, recent germinants that came up in the spring. Common chemicals that we use: you can use triclopyr, you can use glyphosate, or you can use imazapyr. These are our three primary chemicals. I do recommend you see our MP553 or go to the Texas A&M Forest Info website, and you can use the web tool that we have for herbicide applications to give you more detail on these. But the imazapyr is really the one that we use most often because it has the widest efficacy on the species range. It's very fast. We only have to apply 1 milliliter solution per 3 inches of DBH. These other chemicals, we have to make more hacks than that, and there's more labor and time and expense involved with these other chemicals. We want to be able to use the imazapyr, but I can tell you this: if you have an injection crew that's inexperienced or doesn't understand the nature of imazapyr, you can do some real damage in hardwood stands. Imazapyr was designed to kill hardwoods. And if you have someone that's allowing that chemical to get into the soil through sloppy injection work or spraying turtles or snakes or something like that, you could kill some overstory trees. And so if you're going to use imazapyr, you need to have a crew that understands how to inject properly. With triclopyr and glyphosate, there's really no risk to misapplication and damage to the overstory trees. But they're more costly and more time consuming. And so from a feasibility standpoint, we really try to run with the imazapyr. Okay, the timing best is late growing season, this time of the year. Dormant season still fine. We just want to avoid the green up to mid growing season. So that early growing season, we want to avoid injecting during that time. All right, so let's walk through a bottomland example of where we've done some of this work. And we're going to start out here at our research station in the Delta. We're going to start here at a research station over in the Delta where we have a harvesting demonstration area in place, and so we did different cutting regimes in there, and then followed those over a period of a few years. We did do clear cuts where we removed almost all of the canopy trees. Pre-harvest advanced oak reproduction was inadequate. There was some present, but it was inadequate. Post-harvest, we only had scattered reproduction, and there were some small oaks that were not harvested that were present. These sites, the wet areas did come back to black willow. So I think as these sites, if you get some flooding in here and get some acorns deposited in here, you could have oaks actually come into this stand over time but we're giving up years here. You know, that's the problem. And so we have to go through a cycle of getting oak regeneration in place through animals and flooding and whatnot. The oak reproduction that was present developed well. I talked about that earlier. Large advanced oak regeneration in a clear cut, as you can see here with this nut-all oak, developed very well. Okay, this area, we had a basal area 50 plus mid-story removal. Again, this gave us our best response here. As we can see with the nut-all oak response and this drain that went through here, this was a low flat here, so we had a lot of nut-all oak natural regeneration in here. We had proper sunlight conditions for oak seedling development, and I think this was 3 or 4 years after treatment. We were looking at 400 seedlings per acre greater than 3 feet. We had approximately 500 seedlings per acre from 1 to 3 feet. We did not have down the road the smaller regeneration pool in here, and I think that was because of some of the flooding combined with some of the competing vegetation here. We were losing that component. So this is, you know, these 900 or so stems, maybe 1,000 if you get a few of these through, you know, but that's plenty. You know, that's going to regenerate that area quite well over time. And so just to give you an example of some of the numbers. Basal area 70, that's this area here. This was kind of an inadvertent treatment where we ran into, we're over in the Delta, we ran out of a pulpwood market, and so the harvester left on us and left us with the pulpwood. We did do the injection work in here, but we were left with the pulpwood. And so we talked about not being able to remove pulpwood in one of these stands. So we kind of wound up with a basal area 70 plus mid-story removal. And you can see we had very, very few oak seedlings per acre in this treatment. And this is some of the ground cover in here. So you had the shade, plus this area floods pretty commonly. And so that environment, the oak seedlings just could not reproduce in this area. So that's just one example. And then I wanted to walk through another example that we have just been wrapping up this season. And this is one in the Western Gulf, and it's on the McNeely Creek, which is a tributary of the Little Missouri River in southwest Arkansas. This is in collaboration with the Ross Foundation, so some of those guys are on here today, and I want to give them credit and thank them for working with us on this project. It's been a successful project. This was a shelterwood study where we looked at some different injection and harvesting combinations, and but overall everything was injected. We looked at triclopyr and imazapyr in different combinations through here because there was a lot of American holly throughout the stand, and we want to look at ways to control that. And just to give you that result, both the imazapyr and the imazapyr plus triclopyr both performed pretty well in the control or at least setback of the American holly. That's the species that can be resistant to imazapyr, but when we injected it at a rate of 20% imazapyr and 80% water, or reduce that down to 15% imazapyr and 25% triclopyr, both of those treatments we saw control of the mid-story holly that was in place. And so take home was we really didn't need the triclopyr. I thought maybe we needed the triclopyr mixed in there with it, but we didn't. The high rate of if we did a foliar application, the imazapyr wouldn't control the holly very well, but that high injection rate being put into the stem did just fine. Excuse me. So this area it's basically an island, and so you get sheet flow across here, and it floods. It's flash floods on pretty much every year. This stand though was about 70 to 80 years old, and it's a tremendous cherry bark oak site. As you can see, we talked about cherry bark oak on some of these small rivers and streams in the Western Gulf region. Well, this is one of our hosses right here, and it had actually been trimmed for the mill to help the mill out a little bit. So this tree at stump was almost 5 feet in diameter. This is a 5-foot pole right here, height pole that I use. So you can see the size of some of these trees in here that we were dealing with. And so if somebody asked what is an oversized hardwood tree, well, this is an example right here. This is good because boy, it's highly valuable, but finding someone that knows how to fell these trees and can handle these trees. We had trucks leaving out of here with 3 logs on them. That's how large the material was in here. and that's great, but there's only a handful of mills that can handle those, and a handful of harvesters that can handle those. And so that's one of the things I talked about earlier. Let's get these as fun as they are to observe and harvest and all of that. We really need to work on getting the diameters down below 30 inches on these trees before when we conduct our final harvest, our regeneration harvest. But these were predominantly cherry bark oak overstories with very little oak in the mid-story or understory. Well, I'll take that back. There was some oak regeneration in place, but our mid-story was basically no oak coming back. We were transitioning to shade-tolerant elm and holly and those species that we really don't want to be managing for. Okay, so 3 years post-harvest, we just measured these, and one thing I do need to point out, the storms we had earlier this year that went across South Arkansas hit this stand, and a portion of the stand was damaged pretty severely by the system, but our project was basically over. The shelter would have been in place for about 2.5 years at that point in time. We would have liked to have it finish out the growing season. We were going to begin this final harvest on it this fall anyway, but we've had to go in and do a salvage harvest in there, and so I couldn't get back to all of my plots, but we got enough of the plots measured to get an idea for what we're looking at here, and basically it is covered up with cherry bark oak regeneration in there. When we measured this, we were looking at 200 to 400 oak seedlings per acre, so that was including primarily cherry bark, but some other oak species as well. 400 to 600 in the 1 to 3 foot range, but overall, even if we didn't have this component, we have more than 3,000 oaks per acre, and they're less than a foot tall. And if you have that number, some of those are going to make it through. And so basically, this stand is regenerated. It took 3 years to get there. We didn't have these. If you look at this height class 2 and height class 3, we really didn't have the numbers until that 3rd year. It took 3 years to get there, but we started seeing those seedlings come on strong, and they made that physiological adjustment from their initial status through year 2 into year 3, and now they're really putting on some good height growth. As you can see in this image, there's a good growth flush going on in the middle of the growing season this year for these seedlings. And so those are just some examples to drive that home, and be glad to take any questions that you have.